بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد بن عبد الله النبي الصادق الأمين، وعلى آله وصحبه الطيبين الطاهرين، وكل صحبه طيبون طاهرون، وعلى من اتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين، وعنا معهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين، اللهم آمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Ramadan Kareem for all, for each and everyone, those who are attending and those who are not. Ramadan Kareem for all Muslims. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a different Ramadan, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the next Ramadan even better. This is our 11th program series of Ramadan session program, started 10 years ago. It started differently at home, and then at a masjid, and then masjid and Zoom. And now because of the pandemic, we are doing it only through Zoom. We hope, inshallah, Rabbil Alameen, that Allah will uplift this pandemic and go back also to a masjid, and will still also streaming through Zoom and Facebook. Ramadan sessions are meant to be, just to give some background about it, are meant to be diverse. Although they are held in month of Ramadan, but we are discussing spiritual, intellectual, and political issues, because these things are not antagonists. We don't view them as antagonistic to each other. We don't have more differences between separation between matter and spirit and politics. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Every year we choose different topics, and for this year, last year we addressed atheism, issue of evil, and the issue of certainty. This year, after mutual discussion and consultation with different people, different areas, we chose these 4 important topics, which are mentioned in the program, in the announcement of the program. We received some notes from different people, different places in the world regarding this program. Let me share with you just one letter we got about this year's program. The brother said, quote, "For those interested in getting a critical introduction to some of the ideological concepts of the world today is constructed by the series by. This series is starting today with Dr. Anjum presenting liberalism. It's always refreshing to read and listen to Dr. Anjum, as he always strikes me with his ability to introduce complex and dominant concepts in an easy yet critical way. He mentioned one note that we should be aware of the time difference, which is very really difficult, and inshallah the team will take this note in consideration for the future. And note 2, he says this should not be approached as indoctrination, all caps, for or against any of the concepts therein. It best be approached as an opportunity to stimulate your mind and to build or revisit your own views on this particular version of dunya as Allah destined us to live through. And I'm very sure that all of our great speakers will keep this in their mind. I don't think that any one of them will use the indoctrination approach. And we don't agree, of course, with the indoctrination approach. With this, I will leave it to our moderator, Brother Zaid Hannini. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Barakallahu feek, Abu Tariq. So, Jazakallahu khair, everyone, for attending Al-Arqam Institute's 11th annual Ramadan series. Inshallah, today is the first session out of 4 that we have for this month, where we're going to be covering, inshallah, the topic of liberalism by Dr. Ovamir Anjum. Just before I introduce Dr. Ovamir, I wanted to take care of a couple of housekeeping rules. So if you guys could please keep your microphones off throughout the entirety of the session, as to not disturb the speaker or to cause a distraction during the session. And also, if you have any questions throughout the entirety of the session, please message the host called Q&A. We will keep track of all the questions that you have throughout the session, and we'll be able to answer them and address them in a time period after the speaker is done. So inshallah, Dr. Ovamir Anjum is the Imam Khattab Endowed Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. His work focuses on theology, ethics, politics, and law in Islam, with comparative interest in Western thought. Trained as a historian, his work is interdisciplinary, drawing on the fields of classical Islamic studies, political philosophy, and cultural anthropology. Dr. Anjum obtained his PhD in Islamic intellectual history in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of a few notable works, one being Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought, the Taymiyyan Moment, and he has translated Madarij al-Salikin by Ibn al-Qayyim. So without further ado, Dr. Ovamir, the floor is yours, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا ولك الحمد حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه. This is such a blessed month to be speaking to brothers and sisters and elders who are interested in learning about the world from the perspective of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is a blessed gathering, as Ustad Abu Tariq said, when we look at the world, you know, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam engaged in policy and war during this month. As we know, the very first battle and the most blessed of them was waged during the month of Ramadan, and that is very much the essence of our deen. I will have quite a bit to say. The topic of liberalism is one that is quite complicated and difficult to grasp, not because it is unfamiliar, but because it is too familiar. So it's kind of like you can't really distinguish it from many things that, you know, you don't have much to compare it against, because many of you grew up in it, and many ideas, even when you think critically, you may be thinking from within a liberal paradigm. So it's kind of like, you know, if everything was blue, you would really not be able to tell the color blue. You simply would see a void. And in the same way, liberalism, being the norm that has dominated the world for the last couple of centuries, it is difficult to identify its influence, be it good or bad. So I'm going to have to go into some technical discussion of liberalism, and I'll require your patience and to bear with me as I read some thoughts that I jotted down, because I felt that given the time that we have, I want to read it quickly and then revisit issues that you may like to touch on in the question and answer session. So, is liberalism an ideology? I think that it's important to think about, when we are talking about liberalism, are we talking about an ideology or an attitude or a set of sensibilities or a condition? And here's the difference between them. An ideology is a system of ideas that has a set of key ideas and propositions, which, if you defeat them, if you show them to be untrue, unpersuasive, or immoral, then it's no longer a challenge. You have defeated it. Similarly, if you're defending an ideology, all you have to show is that this ideology, these basic set of ideas, are good and they're compelling and reasonable. But then there is a different aspect of our life where we live most of our life, not thinking cerebrally about right and wrong and how I'm going to live my life, but rather we live with sensibilities and attitudes of my choices that are very much part of my style of decision making, my style of preferring one thing over another, the things that I love, and as the ulama of the past will talk about your al-wala and bara, the things that you take to be, basis of your solidarity and disavowal, and things that you fear instinctively, things that you love instinctively. So if that is something that people can, if liberalism is also an attitude and a set of sensibilities, then it is something that can be adopted and enacted in practices, even if you don't rationally assent to its key ideas. Because there is no one set of key ideas, but many different justifications people use to justify their attitude. And that attitude is then what becomes the key issue. So we have to understand what is it that we're talking about. A third possibility is that a liberalism is a condition. It's merely, if you will, the water in which we swim or the air we breathe, such as no definite ideas hold it up, but that it has become so ubiquitous, ever-present reality that criticism of its basic ideas doesn't eliminate its reality in the institutions and the habits of people, in the technologies that we all depend on, and so on. And I argue that liberalism, because it has been very successful, it is each one of these three things. And therefore, criticizing liberalism as an ideology, important as it is never sufficient. And the same, by the way, goes for Islam as well. And I'm going to compare Islam to liberalism because liberalism offers an alternative to Islam, which is not to say that Islam and liberalism are at loggerheads at every possible step and every possible detail, but that liberalism makes fundamental claims about life, about human psychology, and not about God, but about what place belief in God should have in our life. And as such, it is a competing ideology. And all successful ideas in Islam, including that shape human behavior are such that they are no longer ideas, because reason or conscious thinking alone is a weak force in determining human behavior. This means that success of liberalism, which may have been an ideology whose roots can be traced to John Locke or John Stuart Mill or John Rawls, as you can notice, Johns are the problem. So if you remove all the Johns in the world, we may get rid of liberalism. No, that's a joke. But from Locke and Mill to Rawls, you have a progression of the liberal ideology. Means that it's no longer merely an ideology whose defeat can lead to the end of its influence. So what is liberal ideology? Well, of course, the word liberalism comes from liberty or freedom of humans from external constraints, be that government or community or society or religion. Now, of course, from the very outset, the idea of freedom itself is an innovation in human history. People now try to talk about freedom as an Islamic idea, but of course we don't even have a word for freedom in the way that freedom is understood in liberalism until the modern period, when it's translated from after the French Revolution into Arabic and other Islamic languages. The word for freedom in Islam is freedom from slavery, from servitude, from being domination of others. But there isn't, if you're not a slave of someone, then there was no word for freedom. The word hurriya is new. So the same is incidentally true in Christianity, that the word freedom exists, but its meanings are entirely different, and Christians historically understood that in the same way that Muslims would use other words to express the same idea. For Christians, freedom would be only used as in the sense of freedom from one's desire and one's passion in order to serve Christ. Similarly, Muslims would say, as in the famous statement of Rabi'i ibn Amr radiallahu anhu, when he said in his famous statement that we have come in order to لنخرج العباد من عبادة العباد إلى عبادة رب العباد, that to take humanity, the servants of God, out of the servitude to other servants, other slaves, to the service of God alone, and so on. So that is the concept of freedom, which is always intimate, if you will, indirect and oblique. In the modern sense, you would call this freedom positive freedom, as opposed to the negative freedom, which is a modern liberal freedom. Negative freedom means that it's freedom from external constraints on your desire, on your choices, and your choice has no external constraint. The only principle that liberalism ultimately can accept is the no harm principle, that so long as you're not harming others, you can choose to do whatever you want. Now, of course, the problem becomes, the million-dollar question becomes, what is harm? And then a very advanced system of law and state and all kinds of human decisions and choices enter into this, deciding what is harm and what isn't harm, whether you're harming the environment and therefore harming others, and whether your behavior is inappropriate because it's harming some people, by freedom of speech and so on. So the no harm principle, if you will, brings in all the baggage that liberalism wants to get rid of, but nonetheless, in its simple form, freedom from external constraints is the liberal ideal, as opposed to the positive freedom of freedom to be a better person, freedom to be a servant of God, which is something that would be more compatible with Islam in the way that we understand traditional Islam. Now, there are 3 or 4 key and interrelated liberal ideas that articulate this worldview: autonomy, individualism, public reason, and human rights. So the first one is autonomy, meaning literally autonomy means a kind of freedom but it's more specific. It's the idea is autonomy, meaning I give myself my norms, my right and wrong, right? So literally it means that it's the opposition to heteronomy, which is the idea that appears in Kant and early Enlightenment thinkers, that people who believe in religion, or people who have they follow blindly some other authority, whether be it a government or be it some sheikh or murshid or something, they are unfree and therefore not able to think for themselves. And autonomy then is a condition opposed to both institutionalized religion as well as in community influence and so on. Individualism is similarly opposed to, and it's an overlapping idea, it is opposed to the idea of whether it's any kind of collectivism. So whether it's communitarianism or communalism or communism or socialism, that individuals are first and foremost thought of as part of a collectivity, part of a group, and their rights are decided based on that belonging. While individualism rejects that collectivism and affirms the absolute primacy of the individual. And public reason. So unlike the kind of reason that may be philosophical and metaphysical, that believes and asks the question of what is the purpose of life? What ought we do to our lives? Those are not questions that can be asked in liberalism as a political system. Now, I want to emphasize here that liberalism is often seen as a political system, but to accept that it's a political system and not a social, psychological, and spiritual system is to grant its best wishes, right? You have very little chance of critiquing it or understanding it or defending, if you will, another system, if you grant that it is in fact merely a political system, because the fundamental project it has is precisely to make the claim that the political sphere can be separated from the ethical private sphere, and you can have private beliefs where you want, whatever beliefs you want, so long as you don't harm others and so long as you can live within the constraints of the public reason. And finally, the modern, particularly 20th century form of liberalism that has come to dominate the language of liberalism is human rights, which belong to individuals and which are supposed to be inalienable. All right. So what we need to understand is how liberalism functions rather than merely its basic claims. So it's important to know its basic claims, but you don't know anything about liberalism if all you know is its basic claims. If you were to read the self-description, for instance, of nationalist socialism like Nazism or fascism or any conservative ideology, you would find them all compelling. You know, you'd find them all, like, it's a mixed bag. You know, some ideas are interesting, others you don't maybe agree with. So there is no human ideology that lays out, or system that lays out its stakes or even understands them, because as a human system, you have to understand where this is going to go, and new stakes and new understandings evolve. But there are a few common threads in liberal thought, and it has common consequences. And one of the almost universal consequence of liberalism is dissolution of community and, to some degree, dissolution of family. In some of its forms and phases, liberalism considers religious institutions and community its mortal enemies, but when that enemy has been defeated, it can tolerate them as quote-unquote garbage collectors of the society. Meaning that the free individuals that liberalism creates get into all sorts of problems, and then religion can be tolerated as providing solace. Similarly, family provides solace to those individuals. Liberalism presupposes and proposes a psychology, a theory of human nature and of human feeling and of human soul, a theory of the human being, which is that its desires are not subordinated to rationality or religion or any other transcendent ordering force. That desire comes out of out of a source that is completely beyond our understanding, because liberalism assumes that we cannot understand the world outside the physical impulses and physical behavior, which means that you cannot say certain desires are evil where other desires are good. And this also means that people often equate, rationalism to liberalism, but in fact, liberalism is opposed to thoroughgoing rationalism of the kind that you would find in Aristotle or in Plato or any other philosophers, because those people discoursed about what is good. Right? And liberalism has no time, no tolerance for anyone who makes universal rationalist claims about what is good. The only thing that's good for liberalism is what it says is good, which is human freedom and desire. So that's why liberalism, by its very fundamental premise, it has to be empty of particular content. It cannot tell you specific things. It only makes general principles, right? So it doesn't tell you specific goods, things that are good to believe this or do this or eat that, but it can only tell you general things such as freedom is good. And rights, for example, human rights, they do not depend on people doing what is right, what is good, or what is in accordance with a religion. So they are just general principles that liberalism deals in. Liberalism is against, to put differently, against transcendence, which means that any authority that is beyond and above the society. Now, liberalism lives among and is shaped by many sister ideologies, such as secularism, modernism, and now postmodernism and radical democratic left. And each of these has, if you will, a slightly different set of ideas. Usually they're lumped together. But secularism, for example, there can be liberalism, there can be secularism without liberalism, but not the other way around. So there can be no liberalism without secularism. So you could say that liberalism is a species of secularism, because it's hard to imagine any kind of liberal society that also doesn't uphold at some levels secularism. Finally, democracy, for example, which is at times at odds with liberalism. People usually, of course, use the word liberal democracy, but in fact, there are many cases where you can have democracy without liberalism, right? This was the very first original Greek democracy did not have any concept of liberalism or individualism. Also, even at that time, people spoke of the question of the tyranny of the majority. So you could have a democracy that does not protect rights of the minority or of individuals. And similarly, you could have liberalism that is not democratic. So for example, many enlightened despotisms of the late 19th and early 20th century Europe were of this kind. In fact, there is, I argue, a fundamental tension between the idea of human rights, liberalism, which requires constant limitation of democracy, constant guarding of democracy, because democracy can overstep those rights. So we shouldn't become tied to hard and fast definitions and versions of these ideologies, but because they're transforming and evolving, but heuristically speaking, to make your life simpler, the triangle of these three ideologies, liberalism, secularism, and capitalism, they usually go together. And they are thought to go together usually when Western policymakers are talking about liberalizing a region, a government, a people. They are inevitably talking about secularizing it, about sending market economy there, and capitalism. These three things go together. Democracy, not so much. Democracy can be separated from the mix. Particularly, it's very important to understand the relationship between capitalism and liberalism. Liberalism has enabled and defined conditions of modern capitalism. And you could think of them as twin ideologies, right? So liberalism does in the political, social sphere what capitalism does in the economic sphere. But they do not determinatively decide reality. In fact, they can't, because they are by nature open to challenge and change and experimentation. So they're both fundamentally internally contradictory. And, of course, Marx has famously talked about internal contradictions of capitalism. And one thing that one has to say is that Marx was wrong about almost everything that he said in terms of positive statements that he made about human society and possibility, but he was right about almost every criticism of capitalism that he made. For one, in a sense, capitalism and liberalism collide with human nature, because humans are not free thinkers by nature. We are tribal. And I will talk about the consequences of that. It becomes a liberal pathology because liberalism misunderstands human nature. The second question, and this is the biggest Achilles heel of liberalism, is its claim of neutrality. That it's universal, it does not have any particular content. It provides the mask behind which those in power and those with money, capital can hide. Third observation, critical observation of liberalism, is that it encourages systemic hypocrisy, because the actual reasons people behave are hidden behind the guise of public reason. since liberal psychology is fundamentally mistaken, the individual freedom that it provides always results in the slavery of the many by the few, or enslavement of the many by the few. And these few are always the rich, the powerful, and as such, they're best described by the Quranic term mutrafiha, as Allah says in the Quran, of the extravagant or decadent elite. You might be, so there's an interesting tidbit. The idea of greed was always hated in almost every human society before the rise of modern capitalism, when greed was held up as the engine of the new kind of progress, and liberalism very much mirrors that in the socio-political sphere. So liberalism is also the most responsible ideology, in my view, for letting capitalism run amok and for destroying the environment through consumerism and through basically worshiping human desire, not letting it be constrained by a unifying transcendent ideology. In fact, if we were to do this thing all over again, liberalism's idealization of human desire and of the fiction of free human choice is so central that it would make the same choices that have brought us to the end of this civilization as we speak in the next few decades, if the scientists are even half right. So liberalism is the ultimate ideology of hawa. That is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of hawa as desire, and desire that can take many forms, including the form of self-serving ideologies. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, afara'ayta alladhi ittakhadha ilahahu hawahu," that it is something that people can take as their God. And it's always, however, in liberalism and capitalism, the hawa of the elite, the hawa of a few, but the way they're defined, the way these few elite are decided is through a game that is seen as open game. The game is going to have some winners, many losers, but the game is something that those who are most ambitious can play, as opposed to, say, an ideology that is more closed, that says, you know, particular priesthood or maybe only the comrades in the Communist Party can play this game and decide what everybody else wants according to some system. Capitalism and liberalism do it differently. There are also, how am I doing on time, by the way? Okay, just let me know when I have, so I want to speak for about 15 minutes. And let me know when I have 10 minutes left, okay?
Inshallah.
All right. Now, there are modern and postmodern forms of liberalism. And this is important to understand because this mutual warfare between modern and postmodern thinkers makes people think that there is a deep discussion going on of which we can then become a part. So modernity was, to briefly summarize, was a 3-century-long Eurocentric ideology of reason and progress. Whereas postmodernity, over the last 70 or so years, has become strong and picked up as a critique of modernity, as a critique that can be organized under two main ideas. It's a critique of essentialism and of universalism, right? So these are two things that were central to modernity. Essentialism is necessary for building systems out of rational propositions. You decide what the nature of things are, and you rationally decide how they ought to be put together in order to get perfect rational results. That was the age of reason. That was modernity. Then people could organize politics or society, or even religion, in a sense, could be seen as an organization of good and evil. So good and evil are essentialized. Whereas, and then the second ideology in modernity that the postmodern trends question is universalism. Modernity thrived on its claim to universalism, meaning that what it's speaking about reason and speaking through reason. It has the authority of reason, and reason is completely universal. All human beings have it or ought to have it. Anybody who has less reason, therefore, is less of a human. Now, postmodernity thrives on the particular, on the local, and the native. Postmodernists include various schools. I will enumerate 4 or 5. So there are those who are critical of universalism of modernity. And then there are those who are critical of aspects of modernity, such as patriarchy. So feminism, for example, is a school that has taken on very much postmodernist discourse, if not its leadership. Value fragmentation. So there are perhaps a third kind of postmodernists who question modernity in the name of value fragmentation, that there isn't something unifying for the society and community, and even democracy and republic are suffering as a result, and so on. And these tend to be more traditionalist or conservative critics of that are postmodern, but they're critical, and they're critical of modernity and modern establishment. Fourth, there are the capitalist critiques of modernity, but they're themselves very much the children of enlightenment, and they're very much modern themselves. And finally, there are fifth, those who center Western hegemony as the central problem of modernity, and they call themselves decolonialists, decolonial theorists. So postmodernists are on this spectrum. Most postmodernists are ultra-liberal critics of liberalism. So they would critique liberalism, but they're not really critiquing liberalism the way an outsider would critique liberalism. They're critiquing liberalism the way Noam Chomsky would critique the United States, right? Not the way that that liberalism is not being true to itself. Now to Islam. Is liberalism compatible with the truths of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the life of righteousness, the life of afterlife, life that is focused on the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, on al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar? Rather than deciding it for you in the foregoing and what I have talked, I have tried to teach you to fish rather than giving you a fish. But now at the end, I want to serve, if you will, the fish as I bake it. Meaning why I think that Islam is incompatible with liberalism as a way of life, even though there are many points of conversation and dialogue and learning. And certainly liberalism has a tremendous success that Islam as a way of life and a system has currently does not come close to, and that is something that we have to worry about. As I speak about this from the Islamic perspective, I want to remind you of a couple of common mistakes when Muslims speak about liberalism. First of all, people think Muslims who justify liberalism tend to say that liberalism is neutral vis-a-vis religion. And it is so only if religion is understood in strictly secularized terms. Liberalism it privatizes religion. And only Protestant Christianity, which was born about the same time as liberalism or shortly before, even Protestantism, only in its tame secular form, ever fit the model of what liberalism defines as the right kind of religion. As such, liberalism is diametrically opposed to Islam as a system, as a way of life, which demands to shape public life according to a moral imperative. Right? So, but philosophically, liberalism says, if you will, if I could radically simplify, liberalism says, ask the question of how to live separately from ask the question of what life is, what the nature, purpose, morality, or moral of life. Those two questions are separate. One is a question of fact, the other of value, and the two cannot meet. Whereas Islam begins by saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you in order to worship him. So the very first fact demands that you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Life is fundamentally moral. Life cannot be separated between fact and value, between, you can organize your society and politics in one way and morality in another way. This is not only the case only with Islam, but every religion, every ideology, every system of thought, whether it's pre-modern Greek philosophies or Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism, all ways of thinking think of fact and value together, right? But once you start thinking the way that liberalism does, then there is no way to put fact and value back together. And that's a problem in philosophy that I don't want to get into. But it's a problem in liberal philosophy. How can you justify any morality, right? Why is it bad to lie or cheat or kill or rape or maim? Other than merely personal choice, there can be no grounding, no rational grounding for any moral imperative. The reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to shape our public life in accordance with his commands, which we call Islam, and it's important in our discourse to not equate Islam to just a system of life that among many, right? Islam is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator, the master, the sustainer, demands and loves. And so it is the reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't allow us to separate public and private lives is because human life cannot be compartmentalized between public and private, because our personal commitments are always important in making our public life. And similarly, what happens in public life shapes the personal desires and moralities of individuals all everywhere. And this is true in the United States as anywhere else. U.S. is the only country with a disestablishment clause, but nearly every significant phase in American history and every part of Islamic society, of American society, is reflective of the religious or ideological commitments. You cannot understand the killing and looting of Native Americans, to slavery, to capitalism, without understanding the religious struggle and religious commitments in America. So this is merely to say that public and private have never been separate in American history. Liberalism, incidentally, was also heavily used in justifying colonialism. As an ideology of tolerance, it is fundamentally prone to weeding out those who are intolerant or illiberal or otherwise they fail in some sense of being fully human universally. Now, any ideology that defines the ultimate good for all obviously has to be universal. And if liberalism says the ultimate good for all is that no one tell you what is good for you, you decide we're going to simply construct a neutral system in which you can let your hawa decide whatever it is you want. You can be pious in your personal private life, and you can be impious as you want. You worship Satan if you want. We will have nothing to do with it, right? This fundamental claim of liberalism is false at every level, but it becomes the deception through which those with the strongest hawa and the strongest power to institutionalize their hawa and to finance their hawa, their desire, they become the strongest, if you will, players in the society. Unlike other societies where some ideology, there are other kinds of oppression that may come as a result of letting people decide everybody's personal choices, certainly. So that was the reason why liberalism seems so attractive, because it makes this very strong, very important and powerful claim that people are thirsty for, especially people that are suffering, those in the third world, those today, but also in late medieval, early modern Europe of civil wars. People got here because they felt that this promise of liberalism was something, but it was it was a mirage.
Afwan, Dr. Ovamir, just another 10 minutes, inshallah.
Okay, yeah, Jazakallah khair. I'm almost done. So, in fact, this, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to say about liberalism, that liberalism is not only an ideology, but also it is an attitude and sensibility, and it's a condition in which we live, which means, but at the same time, and there is a lot of useful insights that liberalism has allowed and it is very difficult to turn away from it, right? So it's not something that you can merely defeat, because liberalism and capitalism have together created such an attitude of exploration and openness, and as a result, there have been scientific advancement and open societies that have shown many virtues of these societies, while at the same time also showing the many evils of those societies. And when we think about Islam, particularly medieval Islamic societies, late modern Islamic societies, sorry, not late modern, but late medieval Islamic societies, we should not think of them as perfect and or not in need of any serious critique, and that we merely want to go back. And I think that one ought to make very strong critiques of liberalism, and these critiques have to be deeper, because liberalism is such a triumphalist ideology, and it's also one of the most destructive ideology. And paradoxically, it is destructive because of its success in manipulating material conditions, in allowing human desire to thrive, at least among some, and it has led to loss of meaning, loss of family, loss of community, loss of the very home that humanity has, which is the planet Earth. And so critique of liberalism is not a luxury even for non-Muslims, right? Most academics today, if not most, I would say a significant portion of non-religious academics, or not particularly religious scholars in history or sociology or anthropology, are extremely critical of liberalism. Often those critiques are within liberalism because there is no other place for them to stand. For Muslims, our critique of liberalism has to be distinctly Islamic, because we have to appreciate what is good about liberalism from a distinctly Islamic perspective, and we have to critique what is evil about liberalism from a perspective that is distinctly Islamic. I'll give you one example of how one may try to critique liberalism as a Muslim, but in fact, this is only somewhat superficially Islamic, or almost you could say there is really no Islamic content. People, for example, criticize liberalism for being universalistic, right? So liberalism is bad because it presents a universal reason, right? A universal truth. Now, per se, this is not an Islamic critique. This is a critique that many postmodernists and atheists have made. But Muslims pick it up and they say, well, liberalism is bad because it is universalistic. But being universalist in itself, if it were bad, then Islam's claim, as well as Christianity's claim, that these are both universally true religions that are open to all human beings and that look for salvation of all human beings, right? That would be a problem. There is no doubt that Islam, in this sense, is deeply universalistic. There is a fundamental difference between Islamic universalism and liberal universalism in that Islam recognizes that in order to fully participate in an Islamic system, you have to believe in Islam. And if you don't believe in Islam, if you remain a non-Muslim, then we will tolerate you. That I'm talking about classical Islamic fiqh, right? I'm not talking about what Muslims might do in future in conversation with liberalism and human rights and whatnot. I'm simply saying that historically Islam from the very beginning tolerated error, tolerated theological error. Communities that are based in falsehood are allowed to live and thrive and are to be protected by Muslims. That is a remarkable feat of tolerance. But this claim is based on on this recognition of a universal truth that is not empty of content, right? That truth is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and it comes with its requirements. And if you don't accept that truth, then you may live as dhimmi and whatnot. So Islamic universalism, if you will, is in accordance with human psychology. It is not hypocritical. It recognizes that this claim of universalism that we are making is one that some people will accept and other people will be wrong and will not accept. Whereas liberalism wants to say that you can believe in any religion you want, but we will still, you can still be liberal, you can still adopt our system, you can still be part of it. And this is how it sells itself to religious people in any, this was true in early America as well. American Christians thought that what they're getting into is freedom of their religion from government interference, which is an important principle that liberalism has underscored. But that is not what liberalism can be reduced to. So I will stop here, inshallah, and I look forward to a lively conversation and questions, inshallah.
Jazakallahu khair. Jazakallahu khair, brother Ovamir. Just to give everyone a heads up, we do have quite a few questions. So if you find yourself not able to stay throughout the entirety of the session, just know that this is being recorded and will be posted on both Facebook and YouTube. So you could check them out on Al-Arqam's page, inshallah. So right off the bat, the first question is, how does liberalism, which rejects universalism, reconcile with human rights, which are based on the premise that they're universal?
You said liberalism that rejects universalism. Well, no, so liberalism does not reject universalism. Liberalism's actually fundamental claim is universalism. It is, in fact, ultra-universalist ideology.
Okay. Then the next question we have is, can you comment on how liberalism began as a revolt against pre-modern political structures like monarchy? Liberalism promised to bring an end to political and economic aristocracy, but has merely replaced the old aristocracy with a new liberal aristocracy. For example, the top 1% in the USA owns more than 50% of the country's wealth.
Right, so I think that your question kind of answers itself. But in answering the question, you brought in a couple of first of all, 3 or 4 centuries of development, and you brought together liberalism with capitalism, which I think is the right thing to do, but we have to be aware that that's what we're doing, right? It's late modern capitalism that has created this enormous inequality, and liberalism, because of the way that it cannot create universal consensus outside of particular people's, particular groups' choices, it cannot stand against capitalism. I think that one of the deepest criticisms of liberalism is that as a political ideology, it provides cover for the worst kind of excesses of capitalism. Now, I think that I'll stop here because I hear there are many questions, but it's a very good question, and one that requires recognizing that, yes, there are different forms of capitalism. Early capitalism was different from late capitalism. But ultimately, liberalism, by unleashing human desire, by, if you will, disqualifying both religion and reason from disciplining the human desire in any kind of public fashion, it allows for the worst excesses of the most ruthless people. Like, in other words, liberalism is the heaven of people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump. These people are the elite. They are likely to win in liberalism and capitalism because the desire, no matter how immoral, there is nothing, no such thing as immoral, deeply speaking, right? You can privately think it's immoral, but there is no way to give public voice to the fact that these are immoral people with immoral projects.
Okay, so the next question, inshallah, is you noted earlier that the pervasive nature of liberalism has caused most, if not all of us, to be unaware of our own liberal leanings. How may we navigate living in a liberal society while staying true to our deen?
That's a brilliant question. Jazakumullah khair for asking it, because I wanted to talk about it and I was hoping somebody will ask it. And I remember there was a great scholar, a great intellectual, and a friend of mine who once told me this story about 20 years ago, that he was in Egypt and he was really, he thought about the Quran and he was struggling against secularism, right, as many Islamic movements were and have been for decades. And he said that he was in the Cairo University of, where there was a gathering of women, some 50-some women who were all religious. And he said, how many of you are liberal or secular? I think he used the word liberal or secular, but I think that he meant liberalism. Anyway, so I asked the question, how many of you believe that they are secular? And none of them raised their hands. And then he said, how many of you would be willing to live with your mother or your husband's mother after your marriage? And almost one or two raised their hands. And he said, that is liberalism, and right, that is secularism. That it is how our structure of our desire has changed so that we are unable to suppress our personal choices in order to be a community. Now remember, this is Cairo, where there are no apartments available, and there is a crisis of marriage, and there is a crisis of sexuality because people cannot get married and people get old, and so, without getting married because there are no apartments and no salaries and so on and so forth. But despite all of that, this individualism is so central, right? That people aren't willing to live with their own parents or with their in-laws. So this is what I mean when I say that we all have embraced many liberal values. So how to fight that? Well, if you follow the basics of the Quran without manipulating it, whether it's your salawat or the basic, you are, by praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is a great step against your hawa. By teaching others to pray, you're violating liberalism's idea, right, that let everybody follow their desire. You are shaping others' desires, your children and your friends and relatives and anyone who will listen. By honoring your parents, and that's a really big one, because that creates an intergenerational link that liberalism hates and cannot tolerate, and vice versa. Intergenerational families cannot tolerate liberalism because they tie you to your parents and your children, and then as a result to your brothers and your sisters and your cousins and your neighbors in a way that, so Islam in a very fundamental sense breaks the basic, if you will, structure of this. And that's why you'll see that when societies liberalize, when people become integrated, they family and religiosity go down together. There's a ton of data on this. If you're interested, I highly recommend to everyone who's interested in this question, a Catholic scholar's book on this. Is called How the West Really Lost God. The name is Mary Aberstad. How the West Really Lost God. And there she documents with great detail how the loss of family in the West is directly related to, directly proportional to the loss of religiosity. Of course, she's talking about Christian church attendance. But the idea basically is that people who lose family connection, people who lose the sense of what it means to care for others, to sacrifice and to be sacrificed for, they know and they can intuitively believe in God, who is compassionate and caring. Whereas people who haven't had that experience, they find it emotionally difficult to believe in God. And that is why a lot of atheism is in fact an emotional reaction, not an intellectual conclusion. So intellectual ideas of Darwinism or Scientism and other things, in fact, they create an atmosphere, but they don't create atheists. They only create an atmosphere in which it's really the emotional coldness that people feel in the liberal societies that drives them against or away from religion.
Barakallahu feek. All right, so next up we have, what do you make of the current Muslim embrace of the Democratic Party and vice versa, while noting that the Republican Party also embraces liberalism as an ideology?
Yeah, very good. Liberalism also, Conservative Party or Republican Party also embraces classical form of liberalism. I think that's something we tend to forget because in culture wars, people tend to equate liberalism to LGBTQ. And there's no doubt that LGBTQ is the epitome of liberalism, right? The very idea that you can choose not your sexual desire, but and your sexual identity freely without even your biology, right? Now you haven't only thrown out God and reason, you have also thrown out nature. You have thrown out biology. You have turned against everything, which also incidentally, by reverse or conversely, shows, I think, how reason, revelation, and nature, this triangle, that it goes together. And if you want to throw out God, ultimately you throw out reason, and then you also throw out nature, as liberalism has in its final phase done. So I think that you have two very bad options, and I think that Muslims may choose the lesser evil, whatever they think is the lesser evil in politics, but living in a society that is, that are not only kufr, but a'immat al-kufr in the world, if you want to have your cake and eat it too, you can't. You gotta, so in a sense, I think that we have to make these compromises. Because even if you don't like it, you're going to have cousins and friends and community members. I do, who grew up seeing, Islamophobia, for example, and they want to be Democrats, and they do anything to be ingratiated to the liberal left elite that allows them some room to breathe. And that's not something you can stop in America. And the only thing you can do is use the opportunity that we have in the United States, the freedom that we have to contribute a vision of Islam worldwide, to help Muslim Ummah get back on its feet so that this is not our last and only hope, but also function at the same time to do our best in changing the American society. I think that I don't think that there should be the bitter wars between the left, Democratic versus Republican Muslims as they are today, because what that shows is that people's true loyalty, true love lies in their political interests or their alliances and constructions, not in Islam. But of course, there are people who ally themselves to one side or another in such an ugly way that you have to openly speak against them. And that, I think, ought to be done more of. So people on both sides, left and right? So there are people, for example, who would say that we are more feminist than the feminists, that we are absolutely intolerant of any conservative opinions because they limit the choices of abortion and whatnot, or LGBTQ are, they are our brothers and sisters. Well, people like that, Muslims have to take them to account and punish them politically and intellectually as much as possible to save their religion. On the other hand, there are people on the right who would throw other Muslims under the bus, who do not care about what's happening to Muslims in China or Syria or in India, Kashmir, Palestine, because all they care about is because LGBTQ, and because they would say that, well, because these people who talk about Palestine also have alliances with LGBTQ, hell with Palestine, right? So people create this false dichotomy, and people on either side, in my view, are indistinguishable in that they create a very ugly version of Muslim politics.
Okay, so the next question is, can you elaborate on the fiction of free choice and how that functions in liberal societies, given the proliferation of knowledge via modern technology?
Yeah, so free choice was a problem even before social media, right? Of course, social media creates new possibilities and new kinds of problems and new kinds of destruction of organic natural communities. It allows in natural life, but it also allows new kinds of community building, right? So I don't want to see social media as the problem. Remember, some people want to reduce problems to some ideology or something that but there is really no problem that is ultimately the problem other than turning away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so everything else has good and evil in it, good and bad in it, right? So modernity, there are many good things and many, many bad things. There are postmodern critique, there are good things and bad things. Liberalism, there are good things and bad things. Our true enemy is shaitan. Our true enemy is people who are advocates of fahisha, of evil in the unadulterated form. People who turn away from Iman and from belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and explicitly ally themselves to it. But that said, freedom of choice, of course, on the one hand, you have freedom of choice in Islam in a form that is realistic. But liberal freedom of choice has become a new taghut, a new God that is worshipped. And therefore, we must work to destroy it. And because it is an intellectual construction, you have to also work at the intellectual roots of this. And it is based on incidentally, empirically debunked idea that humans make their choices freely. Empirically, scientists, psychologists, social psychologists, anthropologists find almost invariably, almost always in every study, that how human beings do not act through cold rationality. The human beings do not make their choices based on what is morally good or even what is in their interest, but rather they act as tribes, as groups, They are influenced by irrational things. We know this since, in fact, that was Freud's insight, which Sigmund Freud, by the way, as Allama Iqbal rahimahullah famously said, that God sent his prophets and Shaitan sent his prophets, and Sigmund Freud was one of those prophets of Shaitan. But as a prophet, he observed the behavior of his people quite well. And one of the things that he said is how the subconscious, the unconscious, the unthinking mind works. And much of modern advertisement industry is based on this idea of subconscious choices. Most of the choices that we make, things that we like and we dislike, are not done because they are good for your health or because they are beneficial, but based on our subconscious choices, our subconscious longings, this has, of course, there are many things that we can learn from this. We can learn positively that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us this truth about the relationship between the inside and the outside. The taqwa that is inside also it is found outside. As Allah says in the Quran, وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Your outward reverence of the sha'air of Allah, of the signs and symbols of Allah, such as the Quran, or such as the masjid, such as an old pious person, such as a sheikh who is a teacher, such as Kaaba and Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem. These are signs of taqwa inside of you. So there are many ahadith in Quran and in verses that speak of this relationship between inside and outside, which means that which is a recognition in our deen of the that how choice is complex, that you cannot force people just by giving them reasons. This is why when the Sahaba when they went and made da'wah, they did not go and argue with every individual. After everybody knew what Islam is, the Sahaba showed them by their character, but they showed them the victory, the triumph of Islam, and gave them the choice. And then slowly, as people encountered Islam, they realized that this was going to be it. And this was something found in the character of the Prophet ﷺ already. So there is a great wisdom in our deen, which is confirmed by modern empirical observations, that this human choice is very complicated, and it depends on culture, it depends on feeling, it depends on perception more than it does on merely rational. I mean, rational arguments are important, but they're not sufficient. Now, by the way, let me take that turn and talk also a little bit about the consent, the ideology of consent, which is a cornerstone of so much of current form of liberalism, is also philosophically and scientifically debunked. That human beings, so for example, in the question of rape, it's such a major problem. But you cannot define what is consent and what isn't outside of the contextual factors, which is again precisely the wisdom of our deen, that the only way to avoid harassment is by segregating men and women, which is the wisdom of our deen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us. Alhamdulillah. That's all I want. Go ahead.
Alhamdulillah. In The Myth of Religious Violence, William Kavanaugh observes that liberalism legitimized itself by painting religion as inherently violent and irrational, while liberalism is painted as rational, self-evident, producing prosperity, etc. This myth has been used to banish religion from the public sphere. How should we discredit this age-old myth and retake the public square?
I mean, that's a great question. I think that you have, in asking the question, pointed to the answer already. What William Kavanagh does is retrace history and try to beat the liberals at their game. But I think that so Kavanagh's I think Kavanagh is showing the mirror, if you will, to liberal history, which is, or rather, I should say, secular history, right? It's not really against merely liberalism, but it's rather set against secularism. And secular ideologies are responsible for the greatest killing sprees of modern history. And it usually helps to remember that just the number of people killed in the First World War, and that was completely modern war, war of nation states and ideologies. This war killed more people than all the other wars that we know in history put together. And let that sink in a little bit. If you look at all the other killings of human beings that we know since ancient Egypt, if you add up all the numbers, the First World War killed more people, and then Second World War many times more. So the 20th century has been a century of modern killing. And so in that sense, I think Kavanagh's point is absolutely untouchable. But liberalism has the podium. It has many other advantages that I don't want to go into right now. But starting with this kind of deconstruction for Muslims speaking from a clear and solid understanding of Islam is absolutely necessary.
Okay. Can you please provide a couple of examples, maybe social and political, of how liberalism manifests in the context of modernism and postmodernism?
Okay, so liberalism is seen as a modern ideology, and postmodernists often began as critics of and enemies of liberalism. And there were, of course, people like, if you take people like Nietzsche, for example, and Heidegger, these were some of the most brilliant philosophers and critics of liberalism and modernity. Foucault, who spoke of, if you will, the relationship of knowledge to power, and in that sense, he did more than anybody else to define postmodernist philosophy of the last half century by calling into question all the knowledge that has been produced by modernity, by modern institutions, as knowledge that is biased and knowledge that is geared toward keeping those who are in power, right, in power and that sort of thing. Now, the problem is that liberalism and secularism, the way they function as twin ideologies, they do not mind self-critique. And that's an odd thing, that criticism, so long as you are participating in the institutions of liberalism and capitalism, there isn't a set ideology or idol that you have to worship. There isn't a truth that you hold on to, right? Because you have given up the idea of truth. And that's why not all kinds of postmodernist critiques are offensive to liberalism. In fact, liberalism thrives on them, because in some sense, many postmodernists question the idea of reason even further, so that desire is all that's left, and postmodernism valorizes particular desire. There is one way of looking at postmodernism as a continuation of modernity, meaning that it is simply internal developments within modernity that led to postmodernism, and I think that there is some truth to it. Now, you can critique, let's say if you are somebody like Zygmunt Bauman, who criticizes universalism, who's a sociologist, who talks about how modernity has created this, destroy the sense of community and nearness and so on. Now, all of this is can become a very much a private sensibility of individuals who are liberal or living in a liberal system, and they can respond perhaps by creating some communities. And liberalism has no problem with that, because liberalism's basic logic is inscribed in its institutional arrangement, and it's very much part of human, because it is hooked into the power source of liberalism and capitalism, is that it will satisfy your desire. And so long as your desires are being satisfied, people are not going to make a choice that will go against their desire. So I'll give you an example. Environmentalist movement that started very strong in the 70s and 80s has absolutely done nothing to stop the complete environmental disaster and the global warming, even though that knowledge has existed for for some 50 years, and the alarming sounds have existed, voices, alarming theories, and have existed since the 80s at least, because people at the end are in the very ways in which they live, the very houses they live in, their suburbs, the very cars that they drive, are all fueled by a system which they benefit from, and post-liberal elite also ultimately are human beings who benefit from it. There is nothing that is short of a collapse, short of a breakdown of this prosperity, that will make people think differently. And in that sense, the collapse of the American empire is not different from the collapse of 200 other empires in world history that have risen and fallen. It's just that number is in fact from an article by Alfred McCoy, I think The Decline of the American Empire. You can Google it. It's a great article. Alfred McCoy was my professor at Wisconsin. And like the fall of the Roman Empire and the other empires, people can see that it's happening, but the people that are benefiting from it are benefiting enough until the end. And this is something, of course, you find in the Quran very clearly. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that when we decide to punish a people, a town, we command its mutrafiha, its decadent class, its elite that throw away, they have so much. فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا فَدَمَّرْنَاهَا تَدْمِيرًا. And this is what, wallahu a'lam, this is what we see as a cycle. Now, this doesn't mean that we should rejoice in that decline, but that we ought to present Islam in a more intelligent way, in a more passionate way, as the alternative, because I think that Americans and Westerners, or people who have been created by liberal and modern and postmodern mindset, are also people, human beings who are looking for truth. They're also people who have many good virtues. For instance, Muslims lived in India for 700 years, but couldn't convert all or a good portion of the Hindus, because the family system punishes any freedom, any free impulse so harshly that most people couldn't imagine leaving their families and communities, no matter how oppressive Hinduism was. Liberalism is the exact opposite of Hinduism, right? It allows great freedom, but at the same time, it destabilizes every religion that that is not, you know, very, very well founded in community and family and truth. So American religion is extremely fluid, as we know from the numbers. People change religions all the time. Muslim Americans are no different, or maybe only slightly different from other religions, in that many people are leaving Islam and many people are entering Islam. So, and that is very much a sign of a liberal community, that people are making individual choice to join, individual choice to leave. And that's the nature of the world in which we live.
So just a quick reminder, we're at 5:30 mark. Dr. Ovamir, if you're comfortable going for another 30 minutes, just because we have quite a few more questions to get through, if that's all right with you.
Sure. I just
Inshallah.
have to check my prayer time.
Okay.
I should have time for us. Go ahead.
Okay, inshallah. And for anyone else who can't stay for the extra 30 minutes, just a reminder that we are recording this session and we will have it posted on all our social media platforms, inshallah. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, so to jump into the next question, Muslims in the West tend to have an inferiority complex with respect to our Islamic tradition. You will then find Muslims looking towards alternatives through a liberal framework. What are some short-term and long-term ways to combat this internalized inferiority complex that Muslims in the West have?
That's an excellent question. First of all, I want to take an issue with the question of liberalism vis-a-vis Islamic tradition or liberalism vis-a-vis Islam. I don't think that we should equate Islamic tradition to Islam, because Islamic tradition is extremely diverse. And there are traditions and sub-traditions that are extremely ugly. And our commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-haq, should allow us to make this admission, right? That there are many bad things that Muslims did and became committed to, and that became part of some tradition. So it is Islam that we should hold on to, and that is the truth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that absolutely admits of no confusion. And how we should instill that confidence is, well, I think ultimately many people are doing great work in preaching, in teaching, and you all are examples of people who care. So I see reasons for optimism. What I do think that there is a need for is no deen spreads without sacrifices, without, if you will, the unsung heroes. So the question is, are you willing to be an unsung hero of the deen yourself? Because ultimately, it is those individual choices that make up history, make up that future trajectory. In Islam, we have the possibility of turning the tables against any system of evil or against any system that has lost its way, because people can come and join Islam, and that's not a strength that anyone else has. And people can join Islam, but that requires being a beautiful community. That requires being people that are committed to truth, and that requires heroes. That requires people who will go above and beyond their career trajectory and their required, if you will, level of, people are Muslim. An ordinary person is Muslim today because they come from a Muslim identity. These are Muslims, and you have to love and respect them for the kalima la ilaha illallah that resides in their heart. But these people are at best followers, and them or their children, if there are no strong efforts to make da'wah, are likely to move out. So if you want to break the cycle, if you want to do something that will change the social scientific predictions, you have to act in a way that is heroic, and have to act in ways that make no economic sense. You cannot follow the example of cowards, and you cannot live on rukhas, licenses, and you know, there is a room for that in our fiqh as well. But I think that those two things I will emphasize: one, stick to Islam, go back to and learn Islam, but also embody Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, both in Mecca and in Medina, put himself out and took chances, and you know, he is our role model. Usually, you know, sometimes there's a kind of fiqh that dwells in, or rather, I should say, an understanding of Islam, whether it's fuqaha or others, that is built on a series of compromises, especially in the modern world when the entire world is made up of institutions that our fiqh, our deen does not recognize. Then all you have is you get used to so many compromises, you don't realize an opportunity when it hits you. And that is, I think, what we ought to invest in, that kind of knowledge that we will know that, you know, this is something we ought to take, that this is no compromise on. So I'll stop here.
Inshallah. How is liberalism creeping undetected into Muslim thought around the world, especially with respect to Muslims in the West?
So there are two different ways in which liberalism creeps in the Muslim world and in the West. The Western Muslims, as they become more educated, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, or just become more into the society, they lose the great haiba, the great awe of the West that the rest of the Muslims have. But these same Muslims, us, we have imbibed so many liberal values. And again, there are some very good liberal values that we have imbibed, but there are many bad ones that we are unable to recognize and unable to extricate ourselves from. That if you go and talk to Muslims in the Muslim world, you know, it's almost shocking to what degree we have become individualistic, right? The way that many people in the Muslim world care about each other, sacrifice, and how they build their lives around, you know, other people and other religious ceremonies, and how they care about parents and children, and how they're okay with sharing space, and how they're okay with other people telling you what to do, or, you know, these are things that we have lost. You know, we have become extremely individualistic. We are very pampered. But at the same time, in the Muslim world, particularly the elite, are incredibly impressed with the West, in a sense that really, what you could only describe that sense as a kind of worship. And these elite, at this point, these people are a small elite, but not so small that, you know, that they don't matter. But they are upper echelons of media and upper echelons of entertainment industry and politics and so on. These people's values are among the lowest of the low. That is, they're not as, it's not like they're as bad as people in the Hollywood or Washington, D.C. They're far worse. Because you go to somebody in Hollywood, they at least have ethics of their own, even if they have completely embraced the liberal value, right? So they're showing their body and selling sexuality, but at the same time, they may have some ethical sense of how they're being ethical. Well, among the Muslim elite, the liberalism takes a different form. It's extremely ugly. It is extremely, and this is not just the Muslim world, this is true among the Chinese elite, among the Indian elite, that these people are contemptuous. They're contemptuous of other people like them, other Muslims and poor and people in their own country and so on. So you have to look at how liberalism is creeping in different places, and you have to use that. But at the same time, I think there is an opportunity in the way that I described it, because just the communication with Muslims, between Muslims between Muslims in the West and the East, people who have been disenchanted a little bit, like people in the West, like us, and those in the Muslim world who are still enchanted, but they have at least they live in societies where those values have not completely disappeared. There is a possibility of a collaboration to bring the best out of it, right? So I think that I personally feel invested in being in strong contact with the Muslim world, not because there are some hidden treasures that you can go and find and there are shuyukh sitting there who will tell you solutions to every problem. That isn't the case, unfortunately, or in most cases it isn't. But that by bringing the values of Islam that we have learned here and recovered here, and values of Islam that the people in the Muslim world have far better handle on, and recognizing them, right, and cultivating both of them, I think that can be a way to fight back.
Inshallah. Okay. What do you tell people who reject the observation/analysis that the liberal system which dominates the world systematically fights religion and morality and spreads immorality as a tool to expand and solidify its dominance of the world?
Sorry, so repeat the first part of the question.
What do you tell people who reject the observation/analysis that the liberal system which dominates the world systematically fights religion and morality and spreads immorality as a tool to expand and solidify its dominance of the world?
That's a great question. So you have this analysis that liberalism is destructive of morality and religion, and it's expansive, it's imperialist. But and you want to say, well, how do you make this case to others, particularly perhaps other Muslims who may be more liberal leaning? So I think it's a great question, and I'm afraid there isn't a single answer. But I would say this is a struggle for all of us to be better prepared with our arguments, which means knowing, learning history, learning. I think that there is increasing literature within, as I said, post-modernity is very critical of liberalism. Many postmodernists, especially decolonial thinkers, who are very critical of Western hegemony. Now, often the problem with that is that when you're reading decolonial literature, or you're reading Marxist literature, or you're reading feminist literature that is critical of Western hegemony in some forms, but then by internalizing the dialogue, it actually may project the hegemony, because now people are fighting the West by adopting the ideologies from the West, right? So I think that can become a vicious cycle, which in order to break that, you have to bring in Islam, and you have to be real about it. That you have to recognize that many Muslim elite, including many ulama, are part of the problem, and you have to recognize that this was the case even in the traditional societies, that not everything was good just because it was traditional. So you have to, I think, in order to do give and take. See, it's easy to be a reactionary. It's much more difficult to do give and take, because that requires being grounded in Islam, which is an abstraction, and the difficulty of being an abstraction is that it is well, it's not real somewhere that you can show people. So it's very important that you live it wherever you are in your communities, that you embody it And it is through this embodiment that you will drive the power of the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not through references to some past, imagined past that people do. But I think that the question is great, and the answer is really that this is a quest that we all should have. How can I make a better argument for Islam in a way that is confident rather than reactionary? Alhamdulillah.
So there's actually a comment on Facebook, and we wanted to see your thoughts on it. The key difference between Islamic universalism and liberal universalism is that Islamic universalism is rooted in the language of responsibilities and obligations, whereas liberal universalism is rooted in rights and liberties.
Islamic liberalism is grounded in duties.
Islamic universalism is rooted in the language of responsibilities and obligations.
Right. Okay.
Whereas liberal universalism is rooted in rights and liberties.
No, I wouldn't say that's the main difference. I think the main difference is that Islam begins by recognizing La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah is how you enter the community, that there is a community, that people who do not acknowledge it, you cannot go on and build a system of brotherhood and of solidarity with them, as if saying that, yes, you don't have to accept that kalima and you can join, and everything that we will do in Islam is rational. So we pray 5 times a day. You can pray if you want, don't pray if you don't want, but there isn't a prerequisite to join the community. In other words, you have to step out of that universalist claim and embrace a particular man's particular message as the best expression of God's universal truth, right? You have to believe in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You have to believe in the Quran. You have to say the Kaaba is not like any other building. You have to say this book Quran is not like any other book. And when you make those claims, you are violating basic liberal universal principles. That is at the public level, right? You're saying these things at the public level, not merely as your private choice.
Okay, inshallah. We're almost there. How do we combat the claim that only liberal values can secure rights for religious minorities as opposed to Islam?
Well, I think that this claim requires deconstruction and historical understanding, but ultimately it requires, for the vast majority of people who are not persuaded just by rational argument, it requires embodiment, right? It requires Muslims actually doing it, and then other Muslims, other Muslims recording it and taking up the idea of tolerant coexistence as an important value. And in fact, Muslim governments where they have implemented this, and there are many examples where Muslims do precisely that they do uphold and tolerate. But of course, I mean, if you just look at history, to the extent that history provides as a compelling argument for some, Muslim community, non-Muslim Christian communities lived and have lived, right, for 14 centuries throughout the lands of Islam, and have often prospered, whereas the opposite has not been true. The Muslim communities are very new in the West because Muslims never could live in Europe. Nobody could live in Europe without, Jews did, and of course that wasn't easy. So I think that there are a number of challenges in making this argument. There is, you can make historical arguments, you can make theoretical arguments. You can look at Muslims who try to do well. But also you have to pare down the claims of liberalism, right? So the claims of liberalism is that you lose nothing by belonging to a liberal system, whereas you lose something when you're living in a system that has some values. And when you can demonstrate that when people are living without values, that in fact, they're living under values that are undercover values of some other system. So for example, liberalism it smuggles in values from Abrahamic traditions and from Christianity. For instance, the idea that all men are created equal, right? That's absolutely unclear. It's not grounded in any kind of empirical data. It is something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It comes from the Abrahamic tradition. So the entire fundamental argument of liberalism is based in an uncredited source. It's plagiarism. It's the kind of thing that should be failed in an undergraduate paper. But liberalism is based on this absolutely egregious claim that it is somehow rational truth that all people are created equal. People are not created equal, or that human life is important. Again, human life is important is not something that can be demonstrated at all in any kind of scientific or objective fashion. So once you pare down, and this kind, what I call, by the way, this liberalism's attitude toward ethics is what I call levitating ethics. It's a set of mores, a set of norms that have no grounding. They're as if levitating in the air, and they're just as realistic. That claims that they are self-evident is just as realistic as a castle in the air, as there's somebody flying today. And the result of that is post-modernity has demonstrated again and again, right? And that's why I think post-modernity is a very important development, destructive as it is of many other things, but it is an important development in modernity that it shows all the things that I'm talking about with great clarity, except that it leaves us in a very dark place at the end, because now you have lost God and reason and even your belief in any goodness. And that's the society in which we live. That is the condition, the social condition of an ordinary person. They live in darkness, and they only they may adopt some particularist message, but the public life that they live is destructive. And now it is not even a matter of opinion. After the trajectory of the environmental crisis has become clear, I don't think that any conscientious person can question that the current modern Western liberal civilization has run aground, that it has done something to the planet, to human beings, that no other civilization before could do. That people may have sacrificed children in ancient religions, but at least they left the rest of the planet for other people to come and rehabilitate. But these people have left no home for millions of people who are likely to be homeless in the next century. And so I think that we should really feel the immorality of liberalism in that sense, without overstating, of course, the individual responsibility. But as a whole, we live in very immoral times, and we should not underestimate how significant that is.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Ovamir. This is where actually we're going to cut off the questions, inshallah, because it's getting late. So sorry to the brothers and sisters whose questions we weren't able to get to. Jazakallah khair again, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for taking your time out to give this wonderful presentation and to address some of the questions that we had. Inshallah, next week we're going to be addressing the topic of feminism with Dr. Aisha Hasan. So inshallah, we'll catch you all next week. Inshallah. Yalla, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.